Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting Blender tutorial. Today we will once again talk about destruction. Now this tutorial is a follow-up to my absolute beginner guide for working with destruction in Blender. If you haven't watched my previous tutorial on the topic yet, I'm going to drop you some links down in the video description. Be sure to check that out first before you come back here. Now, whenever you work with destruction in Blender, let me just rewind that. If you destroy an object using the self-fracture add-on, you may notice that the object appears to be broken already before impact, before it even gets destroyed. Now, unfortunately, that's just one of the limitations for working with Blender. Physics and destruction aren't quite as clean as they are in some other programs like Houdini. But fortunately, you can actually work around those limitations. And in this tutorial, I want to show you two ways to making the object look perfectly intact until it gets destroyed. The first method we will do in Blender directly by animating the visibility of all of the broken pieces as well as the original object and swapping them out just when that object gets destroyed. For that, we are also going to have a look at drivers in Blender that essentially allow you to connect different properties together, even across objects, so you can control the visibility of many objects from a master object, like a master of puppets kind of deal. Method number two is using a video editing or video compositing tool to edit the video to make it seem like the original object is still in place until collision. For that, I will be using Adobe Premiere Pro, but you can also do this in any other free video editing tool like DaVinci Resolve, HitFilm Express, or even Blender. Now, as always, there's going to be timestamps to everything down in the video description, so you can jump to anywhere in this video that you might find interesting. Also, if you enjoy my videos, please hit that like button and subscribe if you aren't already. It really helps out my channel and I greatly appreciate it. But now, enough talking, let's jump right into the tutorial. Here we are in Blender, and this is the destruction effect that we ended up with at the end of my absolute beginner guide for how to work with destruction in Blender. Again, if you haven't watched the previous tutorial yet, go and check that out now before you come back here. But now, let's rewind this just a little bit, and the effect looks pretty cool. But if you rewind to before the sphere even collides with our cube, if you zoom in, you can clearly see that this cube is already broken up into all of these individual pieces. And while that itself wouldn't be too problematic, if you hit F12 and render this out, you can see that even in the renders, you can see that this object is pre-fractured, which kind of doesn't look too great. You kind of want it to be intact until that impact point. So for that, we need to hide the visibility of all of these fragments and show the original cube in its place until the moment of impact. In our scene, just as a quick reminder, we have this fragments collection here, which contains all of the pieces for our cube that we have broken out using the self-fracture plugin. And we have this cube that I've hidden here, which is the original cube that we broke up. If I show the object, show it in my viewport and enable it for renders and disable all of the fragments, and now render this out. Now this is the original cube, totally unfractured. What we need to do is we now need to animate the visibility of this original cube to vanish at the time of impact. So let's just come to the moment of impact, which is right around here, frame 12. This object should still be visible. So with the cube selected, come into the object properties, open up visibility, and in here you have options to show in viewport, show in renders, and whether it's selectable. Next to the show in viewport and show in renders property, you find this little dot here. You can click on that to create a keyframe. So we're now placing keyframes on these two properties, both enabled at frame 12. Let's go forward a single frame to frame 13. And at this point, the sphere collides with the cube, so I want it to be invisible. Let's hide it in the viewport and hide it in the renders and set two new keyframes. Let's come back, select the cube, and you can see there's now two keyframes and it hides exactly when that sphere impacts it. So that's pretty easy. The next thing we need to do is we need to show all of these fragments also at the moment of impact. They need to be hidden until this moment, and then we need to show them. Now, you could select individually every single one of these objects and in the object properties and the properties panel, under visibility, animate, show in viewports and show in render. But we have a lot of fragments and it's going to be a little bit of a pain. Now, you can easily set those keyframes for a single fragment and then copy that across to all of the others. But again, it's not the neatest way, especially if you want to tweak those keyframes after the fact. What I prefer to do is set up a master object that then controls the visibility of all of these fragments. And this allows us to control everything a whole lot more easily. For that, we're going to be using drivers in Blender, and they're actually really cool. I really like using them. So let's come back to frame 0. Doesn't really matter. Let's add a new object into our scene. And I'm actually going to add an empty object. I'm going to use a plain axis object, doesn't really matter. G and Z, let's just move that up a little bit just so we can see it. So that's our empty here. I'm going to call this one fragment controller. Then let's come to the moment of impact, which is frame 12. So at this point, I still want all of my fragments to be invisible. Let's just temporarily hide the cube so you can see all of the fragments right there. I want all of these to be invisible. So with the fragment controller selected, let's animate the visibility of this empty object and then use that to drive the visibility of all of our fragments. So fragment controller selected. In the object properties under visibility, let's disable show in viewports and show in renders. Set keyframes on those two properties. Let's move one frame forward. By the way, you can also just use the right arrow on your keyboard. Let's enable show in viewport and show in renders on our fragment controller. And again, set keyframes for that. So now the fragments, don't worry too much about them for now. Just look at this empties object right here at the top. Frame 12, it's invisible. Frame 13, it becomes visible. And now we're going to use this animation to drive the animation for all of these fragments. For that, with the fragment controller selected, so make sure you have this empty selected, come into the visibility. Now right-click show in viewports and select to copy as new driver. Let's come back to the very beginning because I want to make sure I select the same piece, the same fragment of this cube. I'm going to select this one at the bottom left here and make sure you remember which one you selected because this will become important in just a little bit. Now with this fragment selected in the object properties under visibility, I'm now going to right click onto show in viewports and select to paste driver. You'll see this field turns purple and you see this little arrow here saying that this property is animated. It's driven from something else. Something else controls it. And what controls it is the show in viewports property on our fragment controller on this empty object. Now I can't select that piece anymore, but if I now go forward to frame 12, that piece is still invisible. Frame 13, it now becomes visible because now the visibility of our empty object is true, it's visible, so this piece becomes visible. Let's reselect this fragment controller. Let's do the same thing with show in renders. Right click show in renders, copy as new driver. Let's select our piece and let's just make sure that, yep, that is still the same piece with that driver on show in viewports already. Let us right click show in renders and select to paste driver. So now this property is driven by the show in renders property on this empties object. Cool, so that's halfway there. Unfortunately, that only works for that one piece. We now want this same properties on all of the other fragments. For that, let's come to frame 13 because I actually need to be able to select this one piece, but I also want to select all of the other fragments and this piece. In order to do that, let's come into the outliner, right click on the fragments collection and select objects. Now, the way this works, make sure that the last object you select, you can also hold down shift to unselect and reselect it, is that piece that we applied those drivers to. That piece here at the bottom that has the show in viewports and show in render property driven by the properties on this empty object. You can see it's got a slightly brighter outline, meaning that this is the active selected object and everything that's orange is the non-active selection. So we have everything selected, but this one here kind of has to focus. Now with this setup, press Ctrl or Command and L to bring up the Make Links object menu. And in here, I want to say to copy all of my animation data from my active object, that little one that we've got selected down here at the bottom, over to everything else I've got selected. So let's select that. And now if you select any of the other pieces in the object properties, you should see that both show in viewports and show in renders are now linked to that same driver. And now what is going to happen if I go back to 0, none of my fragments are visible at all, up until frame number 13, when my empties becomes visible, all of the fragments become visible. And then you see the destruction. And now if I re-enable my cube, which we're swapping out to become invisible at the exact same point in time, so up until this point, the cube is fully intact because we're rendering the original object, that single cube. But then on frame 13, that cube becomes invisible and all of the fragments get shown. And now you have clean destruction. Let's enter the camera, rewind that and play it back. And you can see how well that works. It's all clean and neat. It's the full object and then it gets destroyed. And now if you bake your simulation and render this out to a movie, this actually looks like the original object is still in place until it gets destroyed. Now, if you think that this is too much effort, let me quickly show you how you can fake this in a video editing tool. Here we are in Adobe Premiere Pro, and as I said, you can really do this in most video editing tools. So I've got my video rendered out here directly from Blender, which is the destruction effect itself. But if I rewind, you can see that the cube looks broken already, which is what we want to patch up. For that, I've also rendered out a single image. Let's drag this into the sequence. I'm going to place that on top of my video. And this is just a static image, but it's rendered with the intact cube, with the cube that looks unbroken. So now what I want to do is I want to cut out this cube and kind of just place it in my scene on top of the broken cube until the moment of impact. So it just looks like it's intact, even though we're really just fudging it. For that, make sure that both layers are visible, the video at the bottom, and let's select the patch layer on the top. Come into the effect controls, and under opacity, click on the pen tool to add a mask to this clean image layer on the top. And obviously, if you are using a different video editor, where these controls lie is a bit different, but just focus on what we're doing, not necessarily the buttons we're pressing for it. So I'm now going to draw a mask just around the cube itself, so just around the object that we want to appear unbroken. So now we've masked that out. So it now sits on top of everything. Obviously, we don't want it to be in place when everything gets destroyed. So I'm going to cut this layer off right here. So up until there, we have this clean cube, and then we're going to see the destroyed effect. Now, unfortunately, the sphere sits on top of the cube in this particular frame. So let's reselect the image layer in the effect controls under opacity. This is the mask we have. We don't need to keyframe it so that for this particular frame, it kind of bends in a little bit so you can see the sphere over the unbroken cube. So let's just come back one frame. So here it still looks okay. In opacity under mask, simply click on the stopwatch icon next to the mask path. That's going to place a keyframe on this property for this frame. Let's go forward a single frame, reselect the mask, and now I'm going to adjust the mask in my viewer. So I want to reveal that sphere. So I'm going to just pull some of these points in, just add a few more with the pen tool. Just kind of bring this mask in just for this particular frame. So if I go a frame back, this is what we see. Then the next frame shows us just this part of the intact cube. And then that layer vanishes and we see the broken fractured cube underneath it, and then that gets shattered. So if we now rewind and play this back, it looks like the original intact object actually gets destroyed. Do note that there are limitations to just fudging it in a video editing tool. For example, this wouldn't work very well if there was shadow or lighting being cast on the object that you want to destroy. And obviously we need to work around the sphere kind of overlapping the object. So it can be a bit difficult depending on the scenario. But if you're just creating a simple destruction effect, you just want the object to look fine until it gets destroyed, this might just be an easy enough way to get away with it. And that's all there is to it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And if you want to watch more, just click these links over on the right hand side. If you want to support me and what I do on this channel, be sure to check out all of the links down in the video description. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.